I'm just back from the United Kingdom, where I had a chance to get a peek into some very interesting and very professional objective analysis by the British Armed Forces of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. I was surprised to learn that they have very candidly now admitted that this has been an absolute failure. There are some very interesting details of this counter-offensive and how the Russians tackled it, which it would be very worthwhile to share with my audience. The Ukrainian counter-offensive began on the 4th of June this year. They were trying to get into the make penetrations into the Zaporizhzhia sector to head towards the coast of the Sea of Azov and cut the Russian corridor to Crimea. That was their primary objective. Now, the Russians were well aware of the Ukrainian attack plans. They had seen the concentration of the 9 brigades of the 10 Corps, newly created 10 Corps with NATO and American equipment, especially the Leopard and Challenger tanks and the Bradley armored fighting vehicles, which had been concentrated opposite the Zaporizhzhia area. Now, the Russians had built up, from September last year onwards, a very formidable line of defenses, the standard triple layered, sometimes 5 to 6 layers of defenses. The first row of these was held by the Spetsnaz Special Forces detachments, who were armed with night vision devices, anti-tank guided missiles, and of course they had the radio contacts to bring in, the Russian Air Force and the Russian artillery, as also the drones, to bear upon the attacking Ukrainian columns. They were about 6 to 7 kilometers in depth inside the Russian-held territory. The main defense lines was at 10 kilometers. Now, what has highlighted clearly is that despite about 2 months of attacks, the Ukrainians have not even been able to reach the main Russian defense line. They just captured a couple of villages in the forward zone. Now, the Russians had based their plan of defense on the precedent of the Kursk German, how they had dealt with the Kursk attack by Germany in 1943. That was the biggest tank offensive launched by the Germans in the Second World War within Russia. The Russians had prepared for it very methodically by creating these formidable line of defenses, and there also they had relied very heavily on artillery and their fighter aircraft to defeat the German tank attacks. This was the exact same pattern they followed, except that primarily they used their Kamov, their Hokum and their Hind attack helicopters. Ka-52 Kamov is their best attack helicopter, specially designed for the tank killing role. And they had initially created 4 forward air heli bases, forward operating bases, but they had kept the main Kamov helicopters back in Russia, and just very few machines were put forward so that they would not be subjected to attack by the Ukrainian HIMARS or the drones, like they had done in March last year and been able to inflict substantial damage. So this time they had created 4 forward air bases in the Zaporizhzhia sector, but they had kept most of the attack helicopters outside. The moment the Ukrainian attack started, they broke cover and they started advancing. The problem for the Ukrainians was that they had to line up, bunch up behind the mine-clearing trawl tanks, who were supposed to breach safe lanes through the heavy minefields, very dense minefields that the Russians had put ahead of their defenses. Now, this caused their tanks to bunch up. They were picked up immediately by the Spetsnaz frontline forward operating zone forces, by their drones, by their night vision devices, and primarily by their night vision devices. They were able to pick up these Ukrainian attack columns. They immediately called in the Kamov attack helicopters, which used the Vikir and the Vikir-1 anti-tank guided missiles, laser beam riding missiles that have a range of 7 to 10 kilometers. That means the helicopters could attack the Ukrainian tanks from a range of 7 to 10 kilometers standoff distance. That means the Ukrainian tanks could neither hear or see the attack helicopters, and nor could their air defense, weapons engage these helicopters because they were outside the range of their air defense cover. From these standoff distances, they were able to inflict very heavy casualties on the advancing Ukrainian columns. And something like in the first month itself, month of June, the British have admitted that about 125 Ukrainian air vehicles were destroyed. The Russian Ministry of Defense, of course, is claiming about 900 armored vehicles destroyed, including about 14 of the Leopard tanks. The bulk of the Leopard tanks, they claim, were destroyed by the standoff fires, standoff attacks, and even their T-90s tanks, using their missiles fired through the gun tube, have been able to engage these tanks from longer standoff distances. The rest of the damage was 50% damage was done by the mines, and the balance has been done by the attack helicopters combination with artillery and drones. The entire attack was decimated. By the end of June, beginning of July, the Ukrainians were forced to pause their offensive. Now the Russian plan was to absorb the Ukrainian counteroffensive, and once having decimated the main counteroffensive, to launch their own counterattack. Now, when the Ukrainians realized that the defenses were formidable, they were not making any headways, they were not able to make even initial penetrations through which to launch their main forces, they called off the attacks. Then they came under tremendous American and European or NATO pressure to resume their attacks, which they did, and once again they suffered fairly heavy manpower and equipment losses, and the total counteroffensive has more or less ground to a halt. Less than 100 square kilometers of territory have been gained in the forward zone. They have not even been able to contact the main defenses. Some partial success was achieved in the Bakhmut sector, where they were trying to advance along the flanks of the Bakhmut city, but no substantial gains were made even there. The Russians at this stage started their counteroffensive in the Kharkiv sector, and now they are making this is almost a core-sized counteroffensive, and they have made very substantial gain towards Kupiansk now. The fierce battle is raging around the city of Kupiansk, where there have been very heavy damage inflicted. On the pattern of the Kursk 1943 Second World War battle, the Russian Air Force also intervened in a very big way with their Su-25 ground attack aircraft, using unguided rockets and joint direct attack munitions equivalents of the Americans, and they generally focused their attacks on the villages that have been captured by the Ukrainians in the forward zones, and they have been using cluster munitions quite liberally. In this combination of the Kamov attack helicopters, the Su-25s, the tactical aviation of the Russians has been able to totally stymie and checkmate the Ukrainian attacks. Now, the Ukrainians had very little option, but they have launched a series of symbolic drone attacks on Moscow and other Russian airfields. In fact, they launched a massive attack with their, for the first time, with their long-range or medium-range drones over Russia. The bulk of these have been shot down. Very little, damage has been inflicted on the Russian targets. Primarily, the effect has been more for propaganda, more for symbolic purposes, more for catching media attention than anything of military significance. that has emerged from these attacks. Yes, the Russian flights from Moscow were disrupted, but the simple fact is these flights had to be stopped because the Russians have been using electronic jammers to jam the incoming Ukrainian drones, and because of the operation of these jammers, this can equally affect their own civilian aircraft. So quite obviously a large number of these flights had to be stopped and to clear the airspace for free fire zones. So very little has been achieved by the Ukrainian drones attacks on the Russian targets. The Russians in turn, their strategic air has been extremely active. They have been launching a series of attacks on Kyiv, especially on Kramatorsk and many other Ukrainian towns. We found that the pattern of attack changed in that they were limiting the number of rockets and missiles and drones to about 20 per attack, so that a larger number of target sets could be covered in Ukraine, including also in western Ukraine. The Russians have very specifically attacked the Ukrainian air bases in central Ukraine, from where their Paltov area, etc., from where the Ukrainian Su-24 fighter aircraft were taking off and delivering their Storm Shadow missiles. They have especially gone in for this target system. Towards the end of this phase, we've also seen that the Ukrainians, who had launched their ground attacks without substantial investments in air defense cover or air attacks, because they just simply don't have the air power to support or blast away for their counteroffensives. They have been pleading for the F-16s, which can now be expected now that Denmark has offered to give them approximately, they are likely to receive about 40 plus of the F-16s. It remains to be seen when these will arise. They will, at best, their training will be completed only by January, February next year. So for this year's fighting, they are not available. And even when they come in, it is doubtful how much of an impact they can make, because the air defenses over Ukraine battle zone are formidable. The Russians have their S-300, S-400, S-500 anti-aircraft missile defense systems. They have their own Su-35 aircraft with standoff, long-range standoff missiles. So how good the Ukrainian pilots whose muscle memory is accustomed more to the Russian series of aircraft like the MiG-29, Su-30, etc., Su-27, it will take them a long time to now reorient to the F-16 American type of aircraft, number one. So first would be the pilot abilities, pilot expertise. Ukrainian pilot may do better with a MiG-29 or a Su-27, to which he is more used, than with F-16 aircraft. Let's not forget the F-16 is third generation aircraft, and what dent it could make on the battlefield in the face of such formidable air defenses, where the Russian Air Force also has been primarily confining itself to standoff attacks because of the density of the air defenses, lethality of the air defenses. I'm not very certain how much of a difference the F-16s can or will make. There is a lot of acrimony now between Ukraine and its allies. The Ukrainian armed forces have started complaining about poor quality of equipment, bulletproof jackets, etc., that they have been supplied. Their basic problem is lack of ammunition. They have been firing away, blazing away, and it has been extremely difficult for NATO and the United States to make up, or to supply ammunition in the quantities. For example, medium artillery ammunition, the capacity is just 15,000 rounds a month. The Ukrainians have been almost firing 15,000 rounds a day. So there has been a very specific constraint on the ammunition supply, which can have a very debilitating impact on the battlefield. If you are short of ammunition during the course of an offensive, and if you poop off all your ammunition, then you have very little left to face the Russian counteroffensive, which is now already started, and more Russian counteroffensive may develop. There is speculation that the Russians may launch an attack towards Kyiv, or they may strengthen their attack towards the Kharkiv area, where they are already making fairly good headway in the Kupiansk sector. They could also probe elsewhere. But the fact of the matter is that the Russians clearly have the upper hand. There is a lot of acrimony, the NATO saying that the Ukrainians were dead set against peace talks, they should have opted for peace talk. Russia initially seemed like quite willing to go along with the various peace efforts. We all know of the peace conference that was held in Saudi Arabia, which was hosted by Saudi Arabia, where the Ukrainian proposals outlined by Zelensky were discussed. These proposals amounted more or less to a virtual demand to a Russian surrender, withdrawal of all troops, which is a non-starter, no-go. I mean, that is hardly the basis on which I don't see the Ukrainians having inflicted sufficient battle damage onto the Russians to try and demand such a grandiose surrender and total withdrawal of Russian forces. That's not likely to happen. The best case scenario you can aim for is a ceasefire in situ and a frozen battle lines for a long time to come, because there is no way that the Ukrainians can make a dent in these in the Russian defense lines, at least in the current year. Next year, if far more amounts of American and NATO equipment is supplied, well, they may make fresh attempts. But by that time, there are chances that Russia will mobilize larger forces, and then we may see a great intensification of this battle. For this year, the Russians clearly have the upper hand, and we are now just awaiting that the crucial stage of this battle, the current battle which is now ongoing, in which the Russians opted to absorb the Ukrainian counteroffensive and then launch their own. A slight decision dilemma was created for the Russians because the Ukrainians pressed the pause button. They took heavy initial losses, they failed to make any headway, failed to make their probing attacks, all turned out to be failures, so they called off the attacks. That means the Ukrainian 9 brigade worth of reserves, newly created, freshly trained, NATO trained formations which were designed for the counter-offensive specifically, have not fully been committed. So in case Russia decides to launch its major counter-offensive, in addition to whatever it is doing towards the Kursk area, then these could be redeployed to face that Russian counter-offensive. The Russian strategy was to decimate the Ukrainian counter-attacks and then go for their counter-offensive. So this strategy has been slightly stymied by the Ukrainian refusal to commit its strategic reserves, its 10 core, the whole part of it. So that the Russians were wanting to destroy or decimate or disable a large part of this offensive formation before launching their own counter-offensive. They were going by the textbook model of the precedent of the Kursk battle of the Second World War in 1943. So we are clearly heading to a situation where Russia is clearly got the upper hand. The Ukrainians have not been able to make any substantial or any even marginal penetrations of the Russian line of defense where they have secured the entire area. My reckoning is that the Russians will now not accept a ceasefire in the light of the repeated provocations in terms of drone attacks on Moscow and other Russian cities. They are likely to now intensify the fighting, intensify attacks on Ukraine, and especially on the Ukraine Independence Day coming in on 24th August, it would be very logical to anticipate very major and very heavy retaliatory attacks on Kyiv. Kyiv is bracing for these, and a large number of the Russian, cruise missiles, rockets and drones are now getting through. Even the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense is saying that between 10 to 20% of the attacking rockets and missiles are getting past their air defenses and inflicting fairly substantial damage. The attacks are coming from the Russian Air Force in terms of their Blackjack, their Tu Tupolev series of bombers, the Bear, the Blackjack, the Mainstay, which are all firing standoff cruise missiles from within Russian territory to inflict heavy damage. The Kinzhal missiles are being extensively used, so are the Iskandars. And from the sea front, from the Black Sea, the Russian Navy is also launching fairly heavy cruise missile attacks in response to the provocations of the drone attacks on Moscow. These are likely to intensify in the coming days, and substantial damage will be inflicted. One is waiting to see what would be the result of ammunition shortages on the Ukrainian combat performance. There is clearly a shortfall in the delivery of ammunition, which, if the fighting intensifies, could prove to be fairly dangerous, could create a fairly dangerous situation. By this phase of the fighting will reach its crescendo by the middle of the next month, and I think this round of the fighting will clearly be decided in favor of the Russians. In view of the Ukrainian provocations, we were all quite hopeful that the Russians would be in a mood for ceasefire negotiations, because this war has gone on long enough. But with the recent provocations, it is now doubtful whether the Russians will accept a ceasefire in situ. And I'm certain that given the tactical operational advantage that they now have, they will try and maximize their gains, especially in the balance area of Donetsk, which they have yet to capture, and they would like to make more substantial gains towards the Kharkiv sector, where the Ukrainians had surprised them last year. We can now look forward to a final intensification of the Russia-Ukraine war in this year, and depending upon how severe the damages are to the Ukrainians and the will of the Americans and the NATO to continue to fund this war, with an election coming with very little results to show, we may be, if there is a will to pursue this war further, then you could see, next year, the year after that, renewed attempts by Ukraine to breach the Russian defense lines, and again retaliatory actions by the Russians. Primarily, what might happen towards Kyiv or towards Odessa, that remains to be seen. But for this year, we are reaching a decisive phase of the battle. Thank you.